Good afternoon, everybody. So wonderful to be with you today. You are here for our third and final webinar in a three-part series presented by the John Burton Advocates for Youth and Fostering Academic Achievement Nationwide, or FAN. This series is supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Stewart Foundation, and the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, and aims to highlight key findings on policy and practice areas critical to advancing the field of foster care and higher education. Each webinar has a corresponding brief, and you can find those documents along with the recordings of the webinar on both the JBay and FAN websites. Today's webinar will share an overview of state policies that are currently in place that could be replicated in other states to improve outcomes. This will include policies designed to augment financial aid, provide access to housing, bolster student outreach and support services, and more. Additionally, we will hear from a student with experience in foster care and the Executive Director of Foster Success, the foster care and education backbone organization serving Indiana. We will have time at the end of our presentation to answer questions, so please be sure to drop your questions into the Q&A. We will acknowledge that we do not have specific details about policies outside of Indiana and California, as we have representatives from both of those states today, but we encourage you to visit the FAN website to find the lead for the statewide backbone organization that you might have interest in learning more about and reach out to them for additional information. We'll be sure to drop the link to the FAN website into the chat shortly. All right, so with that, I would love to introduce our presenters. So today we have four presenters for you. Karen Esperanza Lopez, and she is a student at the University of California, Berkeley. She is currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in public policy. Karen has experienced foster care and has a passion to work on behalf of youth who have experienced the same. We also have Dr. Molly Sarubi. Molly earned her PhD in higher education from the University of Denver. Her current work focuses on access for traditionally marginalized students and families, and specifically on education pathways for foster care alumni and the resulting imperatives for higher education policy and practice. She currently serves as an independent consultant serving as a resource for diverse state, national, and cross-sector stakeholders on a variety of education and policy issues. And she also provides strategic management and broad equity and support to build broad equity initiatives at scale. Molly is active in the advocacy community and serves on multiple local and national boards that build awareness and support resources for communities. We have Debbie Rauscher. Debbie serves as the Education Director for John Burton Advocates for Youth. In this role, Debbie provides leadership and strategic visioning for JBay's education work and leads the agency's policy efforts designed to improve post-secondary outcomes for students with experience in foster care and homelessness. Debbie has worked in the social services field for over 25 years, including extensive work in developing solutions to homelessness. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Maggie Stevens. Maggie has anchored her work over the last 20 years in community involvement and opportunities that allow her to directly and indirectly support students of all ages and experiences in their learning. Currently, Maggie serves as the CEO and president of Foster Success, an Indiana-based nonprofit organization supporting teens and young adults who have spent time in the foster care system as they transition into stable, independent adulthood, through providing resources and programs focused on education, employment, financial literacy, housing, and healthcare. In this role, Maggie oversees the day-to-day operations of the organization and works with the Foster Success staff and board to advance their mission through programs, partnerships, and policy work. So welcome to all of our presenters. We look forward to having a wonderful presentation.
Thanks so much, Maddie. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. This is Debbie Rauscher with John Burton Advocates for Youth. And to get us started, I'm just going to provide a little bit of background and framing for the report that was produced and what we're going to be talking about today. So to start, I'll just share that this webinar is highlighting information that is included in the report that we put together called Building Bridges. And Maddie, if you want to drop into the chat a link to where you can find the full report. We're just kind of skimming the surface in this webinar and giving some high-level overview. If you want to read more details about the policies that we're going to be talking about today, please do go ahead and download and check out the report. So the impetus for this, at the federal level, the truth is there's what the federal government does to support youth with experience in foster care to be successful in higher education is pretty limited. We've got the Chafee program that folks are probably familiar with, the Education and Training Voucher Program, ETV, which provides direct grants to students who are participating in post-secondary education, $140 million for Chafee and $40 million for ETV across the entire country. So we know that the interventions that are available at the federal level are really inadequate. And so what we sought to do with this report was take a look at what states were doing to try to get at this issue. So we did some surveying and looked around to better understand what state policies exist across a range of different issue areas. Because the truth is, the absence of policies at the federal level really has been filled in many cases by the states. And there's such a range of different kinds of policies and practices in place in different states. The first of the policies that we found came into place about 20 years ago. Since that time, there's been a host of policies that have emerged, and I would say we've really seen some significant movement in the past 5 years or so. All of these different state policies, though, weren't documented anywhere that we could find, so we thought that it would be helpful to pull these state policies together into a single document. And the hope is that this document will really serve as a model for other states so that you can look and see, are any of these policies that are in place elsewhere something that you might be able to implement in your state? And as I said, there's a huge range, including some policies that really have no cost associated with them, all the way up to policies that cost millions of dollars and everything in between. So it's designed so that you can really start wherever you are at in your state in terms of what the political climate might be to be able to move some of these things forward. And I'll just note as well that we've got a lot of different folks on this webinar, which is fantastic. You don't have to be a policymaker to make use of this document. So whatever role you may be in within your organization, we're hoping that you can take a look at these recommendations and start to work and collaborate with other folks within your state to be able to think about what a strategy might be to move something forward. A couple of caveats. One, this is not an exhaustive list, so please don't expect every single policy that exists to be in this document. It's not. It's really meant to offer examples. And so there are certain types of policies that are much more widespread that exist in a number of different states. We didn't highlight every single one of those. In those cases, we picked a couple of examples just to give a flavor of what that type of policy can look like. In some cases, the policies are really cross-cutting. They cover a whole range of different issues. And we might have highlighted just one particular element of that policy to illustrate a certain approach around a certain issue. So know that as well. And then the last thing I'll say is that we do not include tuition waivers at all in this report. And that is because we did a whole separate report specifically and only about tuition waivers. And you can see the link there. And we will be sending out these slides after the webinar so that you can get access to all of these links. So tuition waivers are completely absent from this report. We know that's probably the most widespread type of policy, which was why it warranted a whole separate report just on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the student who is participating in the webinar. Now, Karen actually had class right now, so she couldn't join us live for the webinar. So she and I were able to connect a couple of days ago and record her presentation. So Maddie's going to go ahead and share that. Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're really excited to have you here. Why don't we start? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in the foster care system?
Yeah, I recently graduated from Riverside City College, and I am a former foster youth. I was in foster care, or I entered foster care when I was at the age of 15. And like many foster youth, I moved schools around like 5 to 6 times, and it was really difficult to maintain a stable education. And so it was really hard for me to feel engaged in my studies, which really affected how I approached higher education after graduating high school.
Great, thanks. So what we're here to talk about is some of the state policies that exist or maybe don't exist and how they have impacted your experience. So I'm going to start with the Next Step program, which is a program here in California that helps support students with experience in foster care at the California community colleges. I know that you were a participant in the Next Step program. So tell us a little bit about your experience with Next Step.
Yeah, to give context, starting off in community college, I had a really rough time. As mentioned before, I didn't really have a good send off to college after high school. And so when I started community college, I lacked a lot of basic terminology or how to navigate the system in general, like applying for financial aid. And it wasn't until I was connected to Next Step where they sat me down and really helped me understand the process of what it looks like to apply for financial aid and um, understanding how to navigate course load and everything like that, everything that I needed to succeed in community college. So some of the resources they provided was counseling in my academics, along with workshops that helped me develop a lot of like life skills. And when I was facing homelessness at a point, I was working 3 jobs. They provided stipends like gas stipends or food vouchers or even monetary stipends that really helped cover my basic needs. And it really made a big difference on my ability to excel in my academic studies.
Great, thanks. I know another policy that you've benefited from is priority registration here in
Yeah.
California, the ability to register for classes before the general student population. Can you speak a little bit to how that policy has impacted you? That can be both at community colleges or at UC Berkeley, where you're studying now.
Yes, absolutely. So prior to Next Step, I was in another program where it was mandated for me to take 12 units, which was very difficult because being a full-time student while working 3 jobs and being homeless was basically impossible. But I really needed to maintain that full-time status in order to be eligible for financial aid. And so it became very difficult to manage everything. But Next Step was able to provide that priority registration and a reduced course load, which allowed me to take care of what I needed to take care of in my personal life without having to worry about missing out on important deadlines to register for classes and take advantage of that reduced course load, which allowed me to become more flexible to address these big issues that I was facing.
Great, thank you. And then, I know that when you were in high school, um, there was no policy in place that mandated any kind of support for you around planning for post-secondary education. And so this is a case, rather than speaking to how policy benefited you, it's more about how policy would have potentially benefited you. So can you talk a little bit about what your experience was like in high school, and had there been a policy in place that really targeted students with experience in foster care around post-secondary planning and support, what difference do you think that might have made for you?
It would have made the biggest difference. Going through high school, again, not feeling engaged in education, I felt very alone, especially in my situation in foster care, and not having that hand to guide me into the right direction made me feel really lost. If I had made the wrong turn, I feel like I would have not continued to have even considered community college. And so being able to have the initial like resources that would have guided me and given me that support, I feel like would have led me to another path that who knows where I would have been. Maybe in like Harvard or something. Like the possibilities would have been endless if I had gotten that support at a really early stage in high school.
Great. So to close, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and what your plans are?
So since graduating Riverside City College, I have now transferred to UC Berkeley on a full ride, and I'm currently studying political science and with a minor in public policy. And I've just found a great sense of love in higher education, and I'm really happy that I was able to be supported along the way with these programs such as Next Step.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Karen.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, thank you to Debbie and Karen especially for centering the importance of really understanding the impact on the student experience these support levers and state policies can play. We know that they play an influential role in improving post-secondary education outcomes, but efforts can differ broadly given different states' autonomy in their ways in which they develop, fund, and deliver these post-secondary assistance for students with experience in foster care. And so as a result, supports range in diverse state level policies that address a variety of key issues that we hope to highlight today, as Debbie mentioned. So despite growing awareness, environmental and structural barriers still exist for countless historically marginalized students. And we know that students with an experience in foster care particularly resonate with that experience. And so like states, colleges and campuses also have autonomy to develop direct supports. So understanding the unique experiences of these students truly is paramount. So as a result of that autonomy, similar to our state policies, campus programming can vary widely across different campuses, states, or institution types. One example of how this shows up in the student experience is academic mobility. So as a result of frequent placement transitions, students with experience in foster care can experience high academic mobility. So this can result in changing schools frequently, perhaps limited access to different types of courses, and limited access to consistent guidance counselor support. And so we know these students have expressed that can negatively impact their college going culture. And so having access to traditional experiences such as college tours, interviews, career planning can sometimes negatively impact these students' ability to enroll on campus. And so because of these unique experiences for these students, it's really paramount that institutions adjust accordingly and these state policies are drafted with those needs in mind. Outreach should be far-reaching, and so offering information to students that are currently in the foster care system that may be missing opportunity through other outreach or traditional outreach programs, as well as flexible and broad admissions criteria that really understand the educational experiences of these students and value their diverse lived experiences and know how that relates to their academic potential on campus. And so we want to share a few examples that really do take these broad efforts to increase post-secondary access for these students. And so we have a few listed here, as Debbie mentioned, not an exhaustive list, but so we see here in Pennsylvania, and while yes, they have a tuition waiver and point of contact reference that we highlight in other areas, we really did want to take note of their effort in this particular policy to identify resources that really help bridge the access to college campus, such as verification and application documents, financial resources, community and campus supports to help bridge that access pathway. We have two examples from California. So as Karen mentioned, the importance of priority registration that allows students to register at colleges and universities and then receive additional aligned supports as a result of that priority registration. And also California really was among the first to designate social workers as having case management priority around post-secondary access. And so it really tied this interdisciplinary approach between social work and post-secondary education that potentially and likely increases access for these students. And then another example is Nevada that listed here is identifies students living in care. It really helps them understand their academic plans and bridges that K-12 to post-secondary experience academically, allowing for them to hit the ground running once they enroll and arrive on campus. So I'll pass it to Debbie to share a little bit about post-secondary persistence supports for these students.
Yeah, thank you. So we know, of course, that the path to successful degree completion doesn't end at the point of access. So getting students into college and set up for success is, of course, essential. But we see from consistently low graduation rates that programs and policies that directly address the issues of college completion are as necessary, if not more, for students with experience in foster care. There are a lot of different factors we know that drive a student's likelihood to persist. So that can include adequate funding. We know that the financial aid that's available, Pell Grants and Chafee ETV, are not adequate to the financial need for these students. This can lead to, among other things, housing instability. That's compounded by the fact that these students often don't have credit histories or co-signers to be able to identify housing. They might not have knowledge about finding housing. And so these two things are really intertwined, the financial and residential stability pieces. Second, we know that research has shown that a sense of belonging is really a crucial element for supporting post-secondary success, making sure that students have that community around them and that they feel a part of being on the college campus. And then lastly, wraparound resources. And this really includes a combination of both academic supports and personal supports. And while students from extended foster care, students with experience in foster care can benefit from some of the more traditional support services, policies that really factor in the unique needs of this population, that understand the impact of trauma, that understand the gaps left by lack of family privilege. These are the kinds of programs that really provide the kind of wraparound comprehensive support that's going to maximize the chances for these students to complete their desired educational goal. So I'm going to highlight a couple of policies related to this. I'm going to start with the financial support piece. So Minnesota just recently passed some really groundbreaking legislation. It's called the Fostering Independence Higher Education Grant. And so as I mentioned before, there's a lot of states that have tuition waivers. Minnesota goes beyond a tuition waiver to not only waive the cost of tuition, but to cover the full cost of attendance. So this means providing the financial resources to fill any gaps that exist to cover the costs of housing, food, books, transportation, all of those things for up to 5 years. So really providing an incredible amount of financial support for these students. Arizona did something interesting this past year. It's kind of unique to the time, not necessarily something that's replicable, but we thought it was interesting and therefore worth highlighting, which is that there were supplementary education and training voucher funds that were provided through the Supporting Foster Youth and Families Through the Pandemic Act, which was part of the stimulus bill, one of the many stimulus bills. And so they used those funds to pay off financial enrollment holds. So students who were unable to enroll because they owed some sort of money to the campus and by doing so, allowed those students to be able to re-enroll. So sort of an interesting and unique approach, we thought. If we can go to the next slide. So a few things we've done here in California. One is related to the Chafee ETV grant. We realized that a lot of students receiving an ETV award were losing access to the award because they weren't making satisfactory academic progress. And our state tied receipt of the ETV grant to the SAP standard at the college, at the student's institution. And, we did some research on this and found, in fact, that 40% of students with experience in foster care were not making SAP in their first year after their first 2 consecutive terms. So huge numbers of students losing access to funding. So we changed the policy here in California so that a student can continue to receive an ETV grant for up to 2 years before they lose access because of academic progress standards. After the first year, they have to do a comprehensive plan to improve progress and make sure that they're connected to the necessary supports, but they don't lose that grant just after the first year like other forms of financial aid. The second thing that I wanted to highlight from California related to the ETV grant is that we actually prohibit the use of an ETV grant at institutions that are below a certain threshold for graduation or above a certain threshold for loan default rates. And this is essentially to ensure that the funds are not used at predatory private institutions that we know sometimes prey on students, like students with experience in foster care, because for the very reason that they have access to additional financial aid like ETV. So this is something that our state actually did for all of our state programs initially, and then we did a bill to link the ETV awards to that same standard to avoid some of the more egregious predatory private for-profit institutions. And then last year, the governor launched a really exciting new program that provides every low-income K-12 student a college savings account that gets seeded with $500. And for students with experience in foster care or who have experienced homelessness, the state will provide an additional $500. So there's going to be $1,000 that goes into an account for all of these students for them to be able to use for college when the time comes, which is really exciting. And I'll highlight another program from Nevada as well. So what Nevada did was use something called an individual development account program, or IDA. People may be familiar with this concept. And it's basically a savings account that has up to a 5-to-1 matching program for up to $3,000. So students with experience in foster care are one of the populations that's specifically targeted for this resource and can build that asset so that they have those funds available for post-secondary education. The bill also provides some funding so that institutions that serve the foster care population have the resources to be able to provide financial literacy training to these young people as well. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to transition it over to Molly.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, so as Debbie mentioned, and we all know, supporting students to and through college means addressing all of the factors that may keep them from being successful. And so we know that there's many campus programs across the nation, some tied to state policy or legislation, many that are not. And so we wanted to highlight a few of those that are based around state policy. And so a lot of these programs address the non-academic barriers that can impact post-secondary persistence. And some of these areas can be transportation, childcare, food or housing insecurity, or workforce instability. And so addressing those really heightens the probability of success for students with experience in foster care. And so campus-based programs offer a wide range of wraparound supports. And so we see here in Virginia, they really take a system-wide approach within their community colleges and provide not only coaching, but academic and career counseling, financial literacy, and really bolster that level of support through addressing a few key levers related to post-secondary persistence. New York has quite a robust effort across a couple different programs. And so we see a combination really happening in New York around coupling support services and financial resources. And so those programs can be used to cover, tuition and fees, but also housing, transportation, medical costs, personal expenses, and further programs also offer academic coaching and financial literacy and coaching. And so we really see the stitching together of multiple supports to increase likelihood of post-secondary success. And also California has state policy related to campus-based supports, and they really are looking at supporting programs at community colleges, and again, offer that academic and career advising, coupling along with wraparound supports, transfer guidance, and other additional personal supports that really, again, wrap around what we think are traditional access support such as tuition waivers or financial, but also addresses the non-academic barriers that students with experience in foster care may face. And so then we have additional level of support. And so while many of these campus-based programs offer coaching and dedicated staff, there are state policy examples that have a further identification of a designated point of contact for students with experience in foster care on campus. And so these single points of contact are able to work collaboratively and really network across all disciplines to connect students to campus-based supports, but also community resources or resources within other disciplines such as social work or transportation or human and health services. So they really offer a continuity of care and often interpersonal relationships. So if the single point of contact is rooted within multiple disciplines, they may have further understanding of those systems, but also the lived experiences of these students that really builds that rapport and support as these students kind of pass through their education journeys. And so they really provide an additional layer of nuanced support that maybe historically higher educational professionals may not have that systems level background in social work or human and health services, for example. So a lot of these single point of contact positions, the responsibilities and the cost can differ depending on the state policy. They can be embedded within child welfare agencies or sometimes at the post-secondary institution level. And so here's just a few examples. So we see that Texas really requires the post-secondary institutions to appoint at least one liaison to students. And this really is intended to help streamline information sharing, support service resource delivery, and really emphasizing that one-on-one contact for these students once they are on campus. Michigan has a really robust independent living campus coach program that again also addresses the needs of students while on campus, including education, employment, and housing, but also links to their needs, those non-academic support levers that we mentioned, such as mental health, parenting support, childcare, and those types of levers. And Florida additionally also provides post-secondary educational campus coaching and has a really robust program that's embedded into the Florida college system. And so we see these examples really nuancing their effort to support students through one-on-one connection, rooted either in different institutional systems or state systems, and that also provide that wraparound and continuity of care.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about housing supports. I will say that this is the area where we found the least, which is not that surprising because it's probably the most challenging and expensive issue to tackle. But we do have a couple of things here in California that I want to highlight. The first is in California, we created actually a number of years ago a program called the Transitional Housing Program Plus, which provides safe, affordable housing and supportive services for up to 36 months for students or for youth who have exited the foster care system up to age 25. When the program began, it was before extended foster care existed, so it was primarily serving youth who were between 18 and 24. Now that we have extended foster care through to age 21, it serves primarily the 21 to 24-year-old population, and it's grown steadily since its inception. And so as of the current fiscal year, the state provides almost $52 million annually for this program. It's not exclusive to students, but there's a lot of college students who access this program in order to have consistent housing while they're in school. And it does provide housing year round. It's not linked to any sort of college housing. We also have a policy in California that requires all of our public universities to give students with experience in foster care priority for uninterrupted year-round on-campus housing. And so what that means is there's a rule that says if you have on-campus housing, students with experience in foster care kind of get first crack. If you have housing that's open year-round, students with experience in foster care get first crack at that as well. And then if there is housing that stays open year-round, that students with experience in foster care can stay in that housing during academic breaks at no extra charge. That does not include summer, but for things like spring break, winter break, students can remain in that housing with no extra charge. So those are our housing policies. And then last but not least, we found a couple of policies related to workforce development. So first in Washington, Washington previously had, they still do have, but they had a program that had been created in 2007 called the Passport to College Promise Scholarship Program. And so in 2018, this program was renamed to the Passport to Careers program and was expanded to include students with experience in foster care who are participating in apprenticeships. So it was no longer limited to those who were just enrolled in college. And it includes targeted outreach, case management. It offers support for apprenticeship completion by offering planning, institutional support, financial assistance, and a variety of wraparound services to support young people who may be participating in internship programs. One other unique element of the program was, and this was created actually with the original Passport to College program, but carried over into the Passport to Careers, is that there's a data sharing agreement between the Washington Student Aid Commission, not sure if I got that acronym totally right, and the Department of Children, Youth, and Family Services, which allows WSAC to verify participants' status as having been in the foster care system, and thereby reducing the burden on the young person. Washington Student Achievement Council, thank you. I got that completely wrong. So that is the program in Washington. And then there's another policy initiative that actually exists in several states, so Ohio, Nevada, and California. And this is a waiver that was requested by these states from the Department of Labor to be able to broaden the availability of workforce services that are provided through workforce development boards with federal funding to serve more youth with experience in foster care. And so the way that the rules for that program work is that those programs have to spend a certain percentage of the money on out-of-school youth. And so the waiver allows these programs to serve more students with experience in foster care, or more youth with experience in foster care as well as those with experience in juvenile justice systems or homelessness who are in school. So they kind of don't count towards that maximum amount that can be spent on youth who are in school. So it expands the services. So that's the overview of our policies. Now there's a few policies that we're really excited to have a representative from Foster to Success, Dr. Maggie Stevens, who's the CEO and president of Foster to Success, who does work in more than one state, but one of which is Indiana. And so she's going to talk about some of the policy successes that they've had in the state of Indiana.
Great. Thanks, Debbie. And good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to be with you this afternoon. Real quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with Foster Success, we are based in Indiana, and we support teens and young adults as they are transitioning out of foster care. We want to make sure that all of them have the opportunity to be heard, empowered, and supported in their journey, whatever that might look like. And we do that through a number of programs and resources and some advocacy and research work as well. So I want to just hit upon a couple things that we've worked on in the last few years, highlight some of our policy wins. There are definitely some lesser things that we've been working on that haven't made the win list yet, but we're still advocating for them. And then share a couple of our lessons learned over the past few years. And so the first one I want to highlight is actually work that we did back in 2018, or it culminated in 2018, and it carries on today. And this is the law itself is House Enrolled Act 1314, again in 2018. If you want to look it up, all of these are linked, or at least these first three are linked in the policy brief. So you could actually go find it, find the original legislation, and learn more about it. But what this report did, or what this legislation did, is it required the Indiana Department of Child Services and the Indiana Department of Education to, one, create a data sharing agreement where our Department of Education could better track the education outcomes of our students in K-12 education who are experiencing foster care. Additionally, they are required to submit a report to our State Board of Education by April 1st of each year. And in year one, they were required to create a remediation plan. So now that we are 4 years post passage of this bill, a couple things I want to share. One, I dropped a link in the chat where I think you can see one of our reports that we published in 2020 that takes the state data and contextualizes it. One of the things, and I'll talk about this on the next slide a little bit, but legislation rarely goes through without some opposition popping up. Anytime we're asking state agencies to report or do something in addition to what they're already doing, you might imagine there'll be some opposition. So we were quickly told that we didn't need to legislate this reporting mechanism, that DOE, DCS could do this if we asked for it. The reality was we knew we had asked for it. It wasn't getting reported. It wasn't getting tracked in that way. And so we did advance this bill. And what it has done is, again, really elevated the data points that we knew anecdotally or, from varied sources that were out there, showing us exactly where our students in foster care are enrolled. We learned that 50% of our state's students in foster care are concentrated in 10% of our state school districts. So if we really want to move the needle on education outcomes, not that we don't pay attention to the other districts, but we know that we need to double down on resources in those school corporations. And then we also were able to disaggregate the data once we had our hands on it and look at it, both looking at outcomes based on race, gender, grade in school, zip code or county, school corporation, et cetera. And for better or for worse, what we found is that there were disparities across the board. When we looked at high school completion, when we looked on standardized testing, when we looked on discipline rates, for our students in foster care, they were underperforming on education outcomes, and they were overrepresented when we looked at expulsion and other disciplinary actions, regardless of where they were living in our state, what school corporation they were in, et cetera. So we have really worked a lot with the Department of Education, and it's thankfully, this year we've been able to revisit some of those activities to really hone in and say, what do our educators need to better support this population? And so we're going to, although not required by this law, reintroduce a new version of the remediation plan with our April 1st report. So stay tuned. We'll be publicizing that once it gets out there, but really looking at the steps we need to take now compared to where we were 4 years ago. There's a couple other items on here. I won't go in nearly the level of detail, but I think it's important to see, again, supporting the whole person is really an important piece of the work that we're doing. And so in 2021, there were 2 important laws that were passed. One is the inclusion of individuals with lived experiences on our state commission for improving the status of children. And this is a body that includes the executive director or the secretary of education from our Department of Education, the executive director from the Department of Child Services, state representatives, state senators, representatives from the governor's office, from the judicial branch, all major parties who are looking at the status of children in the state of Indiana. And last year they added 2 permanent seats to this body that are to be filled by individuals with lived experience in the justice system, the foster care system, or who have documented homeless experience. And I think that this just really elevates the relevance of this body in reviewing and looking at policies and practices across the state that impact children in all situations. Last year, we also were able to create a new tax credit. It's an Indiana state tax credit where qualified nonprofit organizations who support individuals and families impacted by foster care can provide a 50% state tax credit to individuals who make a contribution. The goal here was really to elevate the need for those other private philanthropic dollars that come to our nonprofit organizations to supplement and augment what our state and federal dollars pay for. Because we know, and it's really just kind of risen to the top again over the past couple of years, for our nonprofits and our community organizations to be responsive to the immediate needs, we can't always rely on the dollars that we're receiving from the state and the federal government. And so this is a new incentive that we're hoping will increase philanthropic giving to our nonprofit organizations. And finally, just hot off the press, last week, the governor signed what is Senate Enrolled Act 246 to establish our Ensuring Foster Youth Fund. This fund is aimed at supporting our older foster youth in acquiring their driver's licenses, completing behind the wheel hours, and accessing affordable insurance or closing the gap when they can't access affordable insurance because they're buying single person policies and not joining family policies like many of their peers are. So we're really excited about that. As we jump on to the next slide, I can tell you a little bit more about our journey to get that fund established and where we go from there. So the big thing, to keep in mind as we're thinking through this, what's worked for us, what hasn't worked for us, is let the lived experience of the young people you are working with be your guide, whether that is helping you identify priorities that you need to work on or sharing their stories at the State House. We have been very fortunate to have young people who are passionate about creating change and are bold enough to share their stories at our State House with legislators, lawmakers, and agency executives. And I think that both letting that inform what we propose in legislation and allowing them to be side by side with us and sharing why this is important. I typically speak to the nitty gritty and the real technical stuff. And we let our young people come share why these policy changes can make a difference and how they can impact their outcomes. It's important to know if you're not familiar with this work, the work doesn't start when session starts. This is 12-month work. There might be peaks and valleys. But for example, with the Ensuring Foster Youth Fund, this is something we started planting seeds for over a year ago. We didn't get any traction during the last legislative session. We doubled down last summer. We talked to the people we knew would be our opponents, which were some of the insurance companies, for a variety of reasons I won't bore you with right now, but trying to think through these things. And so we met with our challengers and people who might oppose what we came out with to try to find a solution to get us to common outcomes. And then, we worked all last winter so that we had a bill ready to go in January. Tying in with some of these other things, find your allies and your champions, depending on the setting in your state. Be mindful of, kind of who holds power and what committees and their roles. You do have to politic to get some of this done. But I think there's ways, and what I have found is there are champions on all sides of the aisle when we are talking about individuals who've experienced foster care and how to improve the outcomes for them. But knowing who your allies are, where they sit, who they can pull to the table is really important. I've already touched on knowing your opposition and challengers. Collaborate, always, compromise sometimes. That was sometimes hard for me to acknowledge, is that you do have to give a little bit. There were some things in our bill this last session. I think it made it out. We were really excited. It made it through 4 committees, 2 chambers, with all affirmative votes. We had no opposing votes, but there were 12 or 13 amendments to the bill along the way. Some of them technical, some of them things that we'll just plan to try to readdress next session and fix, because we don't think they do what we want them to do. But we knew it was the only way to keep the bill moving, and we knew we'd go back and fix some things. When possible, and I know it's not always possible, I encourage you to hire support, whether that is somebody who is dedicated to this work on your staff or an outside consultant or a lobbying organization. The reality is that our legislators meet when they want to meet, and it may not always be conducive to your schedule if you're the only person doing this work. So having somebody who can show up, take meetings for you, can really help advance things and keep things moving forward. We are fortunate that we've been able to work with a third-party organization to help with some of those things, but I know that can be a challenge. I would say it's worth investing the resources if you have them now. And finally, going back to the beginning, that the work doesn't start when session starts. It is a marathon. It's not a sprint. 246, we got the fund established. We got a number of things happening. We're going to go back next year to get an appropriation. We still have a number of things to do to bring that full idea to life. And we had a couple bills this session that died, before they made it even to the House or the Senate floor. They died in committee or they didn't get hearings. And so we will be working on those again. Now that our short session has ended, we'll quickly jump into those activities. So if we can be a resource to you, if I can share any insights on some of our legislative wins or not wins, I'd be more than happy to connect with you at any point.
Thanks so much, Maggie. We really value your leadership, and it's so great to hear about the robust efforts happening in Indiana. The robust efforts that feel successful at times, but also great lessons learned for the ones that are still to be addressed. So really appreciate those candid insights. So as we mentioned at the top, we really wanted to use this brief and this webinar to highlight a few key levers and state examples. Karen really centered us at the beginning. Her opening remarks remind us the why of what we do, the why of the work, why it's important. And so we just wanted to leave a little bit of time to talk about and offer some best practices on the how we do the work. Some of these recommendations you've heard touched on in some of the policy examples, and then of course in some of Maggie's tips and tricks. But we really hope that not only will this report be a great resource to understand what's happening in states, but also serve as a tool as you think of your own policy agenda creation. So as you're doing that, best practices and recommendations when developing policies, particularly for students with experience in foster care, is understanding that policies really should be done from an asset-based perspective. We know that students are the experts of their own lived experiences and their own histories, and there's tremendous value and impact in those. And so centering their voices, their resiliency, and their own labor in helping create a policy agenda that best supports them is really important. Additionally, as we mentioned throughout the webinar, is really taking a holistic approach when thinking about a policy agenda or even individual policy developments. And so an agenda should really account for the broad needs of student gaps, or of the broad needs of students gaps in support that include academic gaps, but again, also those wraparound supports such as housing and transportation and workforce development. Additionally, a holistic agenda should be well articulated, adequately funded, which we know sometimes is difficult, and also have some measure of accountability so we can understand the impact of these policy agendas on the students that we are intending to serve. And then lastly, a best practice recommendation is really taking an integrated or interdisciplinary approach to policy development. And so understanding that these students or these individuals in care have experienced the intersections of multiple systems, policies, experiences. And so policy agendas should account for that by considering complementary initiatives, collaborating across sectors, and looking long-term at the impact and intersectional experiences to these students. And so lastly, again, we'll direct you to our full report at the link here. We're really excited to share it with this audience and others, so please feel free to pass along to those champions in the field that are supporting post-secondary supports for students with experience in foster care. And I will pass it to Maddie to lead us through Q&A.
Thank you so much, Molly. Hi, everybody. This has been a really great webinar, very full of lots of really important information. And Maggie, thank you so much for taking time to join us today and share about the just incredible success that you have had in Indiana. No question why your organization is called Foster Success. So we do have a couple questions. One, there was a question from Deborah about any resources that included, or policy resources that included housing or food in times when school is not in session. Debbie or Molly, did either of those show up in the policy scan?
You know, we didn't really get to that level of detail, I'll be honest. You know, it's possible. One thing I'll just note is that in the report itself, every policy that's highlighted actually links to the policy itself, so you can read the policy in its entirety. I would say take a look at some of the really like more comprehensive support programs that are highlighted, but I don't know off the top of my head sort of which programs may address summer time and other school breaks.
Yeah, I would agree. I think around food insecurity, I think is an interesting example of how students with experience in foster care maybe intersect with other student needs or student efforts on campus. And so there has been, I think, in recent movement to establish food insecurity programs such as food cupboards and things like that. But those are generally, focused on what some would call more vulnerable students, not specifically for students with experience in foster care, but certainly these students would fall under those resources. And so there's a few of those examples that some of these policies would kind of fill in under some additional kind of higher ed efforts and not necessarily state policies specifically for students with experience in foster care.
Great, thank you. So one last question before we go. So Asa asked a question. She is a researcher who's looking to broaden her research interest, and she said, or they said, I should say, are there currently any gaps in foster care and higher ed research that you believe are important to address in research? Any suggestions for doing impactful research to support higher education access for students with experience in foster care?
So I have a thought on that. What I'll say sort of generally is that we need more research on how effective these programs are. So we've got these great policies that are now in place, and it can be very challenging to tease out what's the impact of this policy versus everything else going on in a person's life. However, nonetheless, the more that we can start to gauge impact, to really understand which of these approaches has the greatest level of success, so that we can really target the interventions towards that which is going to be most impactful. The more we can do to look at that, I think the better, and that's where I see some of the gaps.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. I see that you dropped a link regarding housing and food resources on college campuses in Indiana. We will be sure to include that in our list of resources. And with that, I will say thank you to everybody who joined us. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and be sure to find our reports on both the JBay and FAN websites. Have a wonderful day, afternoon, everybody. Goodbye.